Have you ever really stopped to think about modesty? You know, we all tend to think it's about what we wear or what we don't wear, but what if I told you that whole idea is just wrong? What if the feeling of modesty has almost nothing to do with clothes and everything to do with a kind of alarm system deep inside our own minds? Okay, let's get into it.
So let's just start with the biggest question of all, the one that frames this whole thing. Why do we even feel modest in the first place? The answer seems super obvious, right? But as you're about to see, the obvious answer, well, it's not the right one.
And this brings us straight to what you could call the nakedness paradox. On one hand, you've got the common belief. We feel modest or even ashamed because we're naked, so we invented clothes to cover up. Simple. But then you look at the evidence, and bam! Anthropologists have shown us that tons of cultures around the world have lived completely naked and felt zero shame. This paradox is a huge clue that we've been looking in the wrong place entirely.
All right, so to get to the real answer, we've got to clear away the wrong ones first. Let's start by debunking a few of the usual suspects when it comes to where modesty comes from.
First up, the shame theory, the idea that we're naturally ashamed of being naked. We just saw how that one falls apart. Next is the attraction theory. This one says we invented clothes to be more attractive, and modesty came from taking them off. But that doesn't work either, because the feeling of modesty exists even in cultures that don't wear clothes. And finally, you've got the disgust theory, which says we feel modest because we're disgusted by other people's immodesty. But think about it, that's a reaction, not an origin. It's a symptom, not the actual cause.
And get this isn't some new idea. Over 100 years ago, the sociologist William I. Thomas put it perfectly. The very beginning of modesty has basically nothing to do with clothes. So if it's not about what we wear, what on earth is it about?
This is where it gets really interesting. To understand modesty, we have to forget about fabric for a minute and instead look at how our brain actually processes the world. We need to understand the mind's built-in alarm system.
So, early psychologists identified this baseline mental state called attentive equilibrium. The best way to think about it is like your brain is on cruise control. When everything around you is going just as you'd expect, your attention is smooth, your thoughts are flowing, and even your breathing and heart rate are totally regular. You're just coasting.
So yeah, as long as that mental process, that attentive equilibrium, is just humming along without any hiccups, we feel calm, normal. It's the mental version of a perfectly running engine.
But what happens when that smooth process gets interrupted? When there's a sudden break in the pattern, a shock, something totally unexpected? Now, this is the key. That's when we feel emotion. Emotion is the feeling of that engine sputtering, of your mind being suddenly thrown out of gear.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. The original researchers said it best. Emotions are what happen when our brain hits a roadblock it wasn't expecting. It's this moment of instability where our normal smooth mental state gets slammed on the brakes and our brain has to scramble to figure out what's going on. That feeling of scrambling, that is what an emotion is.
Okay, so emotions are a break in our mental flow. Got it. Now let's see how this actually builds into the feeling of modesty, starting with a really simple biological conflict and then adding the messy, complicated pressure of other people.
You can actually see a super basic version of this emotional conflict in the animal kingdom. Biologists call it coyness. For instance, a female cuckoo might lure a male in only to lead him on a wild chase. Or a female kingfisher might call to her mate, then fly off, then come back, teasing him for hours. In both cases, there's a conflict happening inside the animal's mind, an impulse to mate versus an impulse to hesitate. That inner conflict, that break in a simple action, is what creates the emotional excitement they need to pair up.
So for animals, it's pretty straightforward. It's advance versus retreat, a simple internal struggle. But for us humans, there is one massive, game-changing factor that gets thrown into the mix, and it changes the entire equation.
And that factor? It's our intense, almost overwhelming sensitivity to what other people think of us. We are social creatures to our very core, so our conflict isn't just internal, it's a battle between our own impulses and our constant, nagging awareness of social judgment. And that social pressure, that's the secret ingredient for human modesty.
So now that we have this psychological framework, this whole idea of a break in our mental habits, plus our social awareness, we can finally go back and figure out where clothing fits in. And it turns out it was pretty much an afterthought. When you dig into the anthropology, the first clothes weren't about modesty at all. They were just tools. For instance, in Brazil, some tribes used little coverings and strings, not because they were shy, but simply to protect themselves from insect bites. In other cultures, clothing started from superstition as a way to shield the body from evil spirits or supposed impurities. And a lot of the time, what we might see as clothing really just started as a convenient place to tie decorations, like the Australian pubic tassel.
The most important thing to get here is that in these early stages, there was zero connection to modesty. A covering worn to stop bug bites was no more an act of modesty than you or I wearing a baseball cap to block the sun. It was just a tool for a specific job.
And here is probably the most mind-blowing piece of evidence. During certain ritual dances, some Australian tribes would sometimes conceal parts of their bodies with leaves, but they did it to create sexual suggestion, to be provocative. It had the exact same effect as when they displayed their bodies at other times. Concealment and display were just two different tools to get the same result. The covering wasn't about shame, it was about performance.
And here's where it all clicks into place. Clothing started for practical reasons, but over time, in a lot of societies, it just became a social habit, a norm. And once covering your body is the habit, once it becomes the default state of attentive equilibrium, then suddenly uncovering it becomes the shock, the break in the pattern. And it's that act of breaking the social habit that triggers our brain's alarm system and generates the very emotion we call modesty.
So after peeling back all those layers of misunderstanding and wrong turns, we can finally get to what modesty really is and where it truly comes from.
So modesty isn't about clothes. It's a complex social emotion. It is the feeling of that internal tug of war, the clash between our own impulses and our deep, powerful need for social approval. It's that jolt we feel when a social habit is broken and all of our attention is suddenly forced back onto ourselves, and that one burning question, what are they thinking of me?
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways. First, modesty is in your head, not on your body. It's a psychological response. Second, it comes from that conflict between what we want to do and what we think everyone else expects us to do. Third, it gets triggered by a break in our social habits. And finally, clothing didn't create modesty. It just became a super powerful tool for triggering it once wearing clothes became the habit.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty fascinating question to chew on. If modesty is fundamentally wired into our social habits and expectations, what happens to that feeling when those habits are changing faster than ever in our modern online world? What breaks our attention now?